I pressed my thumb to the parchment on a secundus morning in the 43rd year of my service to the throne, and I felt nothing unusual. That is the detail I returned to, not the walk through the grey administrative corridor of Hive Solomac's mid-tier processing annex, not the face of the clerk who handed me the transfer order, a young man whose name I recorded in my intake log and have since lost entirely. Not even the weight of the document itself, which was standard gauge vellum, administratum grade, indistinguishable from the several hundred similar documents I had signed in the years before it. What I returned to is the absence of sensation when my thumb touched the seal field. Warmth, perhaps. The faint mechanical click of the cipher stamp registering my biometric, and then nothing. No premonition, no hesitation, no small interior voice suggesting that the document beneath my hand was different in any meaningful way from the routine of 19 years that had preceded it. The administratum does not announce its decisions, it does not explain them. A transfer order arrives, and a scrivener goes where he is sent, because the system that sent him has weighed the relevant factors and determined the correct allocation of his particular competencies. I had been trained to understand this not as submission but as participation. My obedience was not the obedience of a dumb beast driven by fear of the goad, but the obedience of a functioning component that understands its place in the mechanism. The mechanism is larger than any single component can comprehend. The mechanism produces correct outcomes. My duty was to trust the mechanism and serve correctly within it. I had done so for 19 years. I intended to continue. The receiving station was designated Intake Node Vermillion, a name I did not recognize from any administrative geography I had previously encountered. This did not concern me. The administratum's reach within Hive Solomark alone encompassed more than 3,000 named sub-facilities, most of which would never appear in the documents of a scrivener working at my tier. The Hive's lower levels were extensive, geologically extensive, layered across centuries of construction and reconstruction. Each new administrative structure built atop or within the bones of prior arrangements, so that the sub-levels formed a kind of sedimentary record of institutional history that most of us who worked there had long since stopped trying to map in any complete sense. Vermillion was simply a deeper layer. That was all. I submitted my desk assignment for formal closure. I gathered my ledger tools, the calibrated styluses, the cross-reference index, the personal cipher key I had been assigned on my first day of service and had carried since. I sealed my hab unit and turned in the occupancy token at the level desk. I proceeded to the transit bay. The journey took 40 minutes on the downshaft. The transit capsule was empty, except for myself and a servitor carrying a sealed documentation bundle to an unstated destination. The servitor held its bundle with the particular careful rigidity that distinguished it from a man carrying something important, not protectiveness, not effort, simply the mechanical compliance of a system trained to not drop what it held. I watched it for a while, then looked at my transfer order again, then looked at nothing in particular as the capsule descended through the Hive's layered dark. Intake Node Vermillion was smaller than I expected. The intake corridor was perhaps 40 meters long, ending in a receiving chamber whose ceiling was lower than standard administrative specifications. The lumens were older, an amber-tinted model I associated with the Hive's mid-century construction phases, and they produced a light that was adequate but not comfortable, the kind of light you work in without enjoying it. There were 6 desks arranged in the receiving chamber proper, each with a mounted census terminal and a secondary document rack. 5 of the desks were already occupied when I arrived. 4 men and 1 woman, all in standard administratom grey. All with the particular stillness of people who have arrived somewhere new and are waiting to be told what to do with themselves. I took the 6th desk. Overseer Peleth entered the chamber at the 4th bell. He was lean, not thinly built, but economically built, as though he had never carried anything unnecessary about his person or his movements. His robes were correct and unremarkable. He wore the Senior Overseer badge of the Administratum's Internal Operations tier, which placed him several grades above any of us seated before him. though he did not carry himself with the faint, theatrical imperiousness that some senior-grade administrators cultivated to remind subordinates of the distance between them. Peleth simply moved to the front of the chamber, placed his hands flat on the lectern, and began. He told us the following: intake node Vermillion processed tithe debt assessments for the outlying agri-sectors of Hive Solomach's peripheral territories. Our work would be cross-referencing in nature census data against projection models, tithe receipts against population registers, variance reports against standard imperial allowance tables. The work was detailed and required precision. Compartmentalization of document access was standard protocol at Vermillion and should not be interpreted as a reflection of trust levels. It was simply a feature of the node's operational design. Questions about the work of colleagues in adjacent areas or lower sublevels were not appropriate and would be redirected to formal information request channels, which had standard processing times of 30 to 45 working days. He answered 3 questions from the assembled scribes. None of them were the questions I would later learn to ask. He did not invite further questions. He assigned our specific duties, told us our access tiers had been registered in the terminal system, and left the chamber. I spent the remainder of that first day familiarizing myself with my terminal, establishing my cross-reference protocols, and completing a partial census bundle for subsector Vial 9 that was waiting in my intake queue. The figures were precise and consistent. I found no anomalies. The work felt familiar in the way that all correct administrative work feels familiar, the specific satisfaction of columns that balance, of variance figures that fall within acceptable parameters, of a ledger that closes correctly at end of day. I filed my first completed entry at the 18th bell and signed out at the duty station. I felt, returning to the HAB unit I had been assigned in the sub-level's accommodation tier, something I recognized with some difficulty as contentment. The work was correct. I was suited to it. The administratum had placed me here. This was how the first months passed. We did not speak much, the 6 of us in the receiving chamber. This was not unusual. Administrative work requires a quality of focused silence that social proximity tends to undermine, and most experienced scribes have long since internalized the particular discipline of being present in the same room as other people without engaging them. I knew their names because names were recorded in the duty roster. I knew their general habits because proximity makes observation inevitable. Holith, who occupied the desk to my immediate right, had a forward lean over his terminal that I noticed on the second day and continued to notice thereafter, not with irritation, simply as one notices the regular behavior of any recurring presence. He worked quickly and with evident precision, finishing his assigned bundles with a consistent efficiency that suggested he had done this kind of cross-referencing before, though in a different posting. The others, Scrivener Dale, who mouthed numbers silently while entering figures and seemed unaware of it. Scrivener Ma, who always finished her allocated work 20 minutes before sign-out and sat in perfect stillness, waiting for the bell, hands folded, eyes forward, as though any motion would constitute an unauthorized extension of her duties. Scrivener Torve, who requested a different stylus 3 times in the first week before finding one that suited him, a minor administrative indulgence that Pelath permitted without comment. Scrivener Kael, who I recall least clearly, a medium build, medium coloring, habits that I cannot now recover in specific terms. I remember his name. I do not remember his face. The catechism recitation was conducted each morning at the first bell of the work period. Pelath led it. Though led is perhaps not the correct word, he initiated it by speaking the opening invocation in a flat and measured voice, and we responded in the appropriate sequence, and then it was done, and we sat at our desks and began the work of the day. The catechism was the standard administratum version, the same one I had recited every working day for 19 years, a reaffirmation of duty, a formal acknowledgement of the God Emperor's sovereign authority over all records and accounts, a declaration that every figure in every ledger was a faithful record of his will made manifest in number. I recited it without thinking about the words. This is, I believe, the correct way to recite it. For 3 months, Nothing changed. Then the overseer left his terminal unsecured. It was a small thing. A vox call came through on the wall unit adjacent to the chamber door, the kind of communication that required him to step partially into the corridor to hear clearly, the ambient work chamber noise being what it was. He moved to the door, and his terminal remained open, and I was in the process of carrying a census bundle from my desk to the secondary archive shelf, which placed me within natural line of sight of the overseer's terminal for approximately 90 seconds. I was not looking for anything. The secondary manifest was simply there, in the upper left quadrant of his terminal display, where I could not reasonably avoid it without closing my eyes. Subsector Vale, 9. Population eligible count, current certification period, 173,412. I had been cross-referencing Subsector Vale, 9 census data against projection models for 3 months. The figure in my own ledger, the correct figure, the certified figure, the figure I had been checking and rechecking and entering and re-entering across dozens of individual census bundles was 402,809. Not a rounding variance, not a calculation error, not a different subsector or a different certification period. The same subsector, the same period, 2 figures, existing simultaneously, in documents that were both formally certified and both formally correct under administratum procedure. I placed the census bundle on the archive shelf. I returned to my desk. I picked up my stylus and resumed the column I had been working on before standing to file the bundle. My hand was steady. My entries were correct. Peleth returned from the corridor and resumed his position without acknowledging that anything had occurred, because from his position, nothing had. I completed my work for the day. I signed out on schedule. On the transit back to my hab unit, I recited the Catechism of Imperial Order silently, from the opening invocation through the full closing doxology. Then I recited it again. Then once more. I finished the 3rd recitation as the capsule reached my level, and I stepped out, and I did not recite it a 4th time, because I understood, in some wordless interior way, that reciting it a 4th time would be an act of fear rather than faith, and that the distinction mattered. I did not know yet what I had seen. I knew only that the 2 figures could not both be true, and that they both were. This is where the fracture began, not dramatically, not with any sense of sudden revelation. Simply as a number that did not match another number in a document I was not supposed to see, on a terminal I had passed in the natural course of my work. The fracture was invisible from the outside. I went to my hab unit. I ate the ration allocation. I slept on the correct schedule. The next morning, I recited the catechism with the others and sat at my desk and opened my terminal and found another census bundle from Vale, 9, waiting in my queue, and I cross-referenced it against my projection model and found the figures consistent and correct, and I entered them and filed them and moved to the next bundle. The figure on Peleth's terminal had not been in my queue. It had not been in any document I had formally accessed. It did not exist within the boundaries of my authorized work. I told myself this was important, that what one does not have formal access to is not one's concern, that the administratum's compartmentalization protocols existed for functional reasons, and that the existence of a figure I could not officially access did not mean the figure was wrong or that something wrong was occurring. There could be 100 explanations. A parallel assessment stream, a census correction cycle I did not have context for, a staged cross-reference from a higher tier that simply used different baseline figures for internal verification purposes. I constructed these explanations with care, and I did not quite believe any of them. For 6 weeks, I believed them well enough to continue correctly. Then the new scribes arrived. They came through the intake corridor at the 3rd bell of the 2nd Octavus morning, 12 of them, in standard administratum grey, carrying the particular combination of alertness and suppressed anxiety that characterizes anyone entering a new posting. I saw them through the work chamber's secondary window, which looked out at a shallow angle onto the intake corridor. They were escorted by 2 Arbeits officers in full enforcement, grey, which was not unusual in itself. Large cohort transfers within the hive's lower levels often received a formal security escort as a matter of protocol, particularly if the transit route passed through contested or unsecured sections. What was unusual was that the Arbeits did not leave. After the cohort was directed through the lower corridor door, the 2 officers remained in the intake passage. They stood with the specific quality of stationed waiting that distinguishes a guard from an escort, feet placed, hands forward, a disposition toward the corridor door rather than toward the exit. I watched them through the window for approximately 10 minutes before Overseer Pelath entered the work chamber and my attention was required elsewhere. The lower corridor door led, I knew from the node's basic orientation, to the sub-levels below the receiving chamber. I had not been assigned any work in those sub-levels. No census bundle had ever come from below, and no archive filing instructions had ever directed me downward. The pressure seal on the lower corridor door engaged at some point during the 3rd work period. I heard it from my desk, the specific hydraulic sound of a heavy door sealing to pressure tolerance, muffled but unmistakable to anyone who has worked long enough in hive infrastructure to recognize the architecture's sounds. After that, nothing. No voices, no movement sounds from below. The Arbeits remained in the intake corridor for another hour and 40 minutes by my estimation, and then departed, carrying nothing, speaking to no one they passed. I asked Pelath about the lower chamber at the sign-out station that evening. He looked at me. Not with alarm, not with hostility, with assessment. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds before he spoke, which is a longer pause than the question required if the answer had been ready. He said it was a holding station for scribes pending reassignment, standard transit function for the sub-level, nothing out of the ordinary. His voice carried a cadence I could not immediately name, a flatness, a precision. The words were correct and the delivery was correct, and there was nothing I could point to as wrong. But I had spent enough years in rooms with people reading from prepared texts to recognize the quality of a response that had been delivered before, not memorized against future need, but worn smooth by repetition. I thanked him. I signed out. I did not raise the question again, but I thought about it. In the HAB unit, eating my ration allocation, I thought about the 12 scribes I had seen enter the lower corridor and the silence that followed, and the Arbeits who had stayed stationed and then left without having accepted or delivered anything visible. I thought about the figure on Pelath's terminal. I thought about whether these 2 things were connected and decided I did not have enough information to determine whether they were, and that the absence of enough information was precisely the point. The Administratum's compartmentalization protocols existed for functional reasons. I recited this to myself. It was true. It was correct. It was also, I understood, a sentence that could mean more than one thing depending on what the function was. 2 weeks after the new cohort arrived, I was summoned to sub-level Crimson. The summons came through the standard Vox channel, formal and procedurally correct a documentation audit, standard review cycle, sub-level Crimson, 4th bell. I had been subject to documentation audits before. They were routine features of administrative service, conducted periodically to verify that a scrivener's work practices aligned with procedural standards and that their document handling was compliant with the relevant tier's requirements. I had passed 6 in the course of my 19 years of service, most of them conducted by mid-tier compliance officers who asked questions about filing methodology and cross-reference accuracy and seemed mildly bored throughout. Sub-level Crimson was a designation I did not recognize from any administrative directory I had access to. This was not remarkable. I filed a transit request through the correct channel, received a corridor authorization within the standard response window, and descended to the indicated level at the appointed time. The chamber was smaller than standard audit rooms. There was 1 desk. There was 1 chair on each side of it. There were no secondary terminals, no documentation racks, no reference materials of any kind visible in the room. The walls were bare habstone. The lumen overhead was the same amber-tinted model as the receiving chamber upstairs, but in better repair, producing a steadier light that was, paradoxically, more discomforting than the slightly flickering units above. The auditor was already seated when I entered. She was thin, not in the way that suggests poor health, but in the way that suggests economy. Every aspect of her appearance gave the impression of having been reduced to its minimum necessary form. Close-cropped grey hair, no personal insignia beyond the standard administratum badge, robes that fit precisely without any excess material. The exception was the interface port behind her left ear, a Mechanicus standard biointegration node, the kind used for high-tier data processing and direct feed archival access. It was not active, no indicator lights, but it was present, and it was not standard administrative equipment. She did not introduce herself immediately. She looked at me for a moment as I sat down, with the particular quality of attention that is not personal curiosity but assessment, the same quality I had seen in Peleth's pause when I asked about the lower chamber, but more refined, more practiced, more patient. Then she said her name was Auditor Vess, and that the audit was a standard suitability assessment for personnel at my service level and tier, and that I should answer the questions directly and completely. The questions were not about my ledgers. She asked about my family connections. I had none. My parents had died in a manufacturum collapse during my adolescence, before I entered service, and I had no siblings. I had no registered bondmate, no dependents. She noted this without apparent reaction and moved to my prior postings, asking about each in more detail than I expected. Not my work performance, but my relationships with supervisors, with colleagues, with the physical spaces of each posting. How had I felt in each place, whether I had maintained contact with anyone from prior postings, whether I had personal documentation from those periods, journals or correspondence or private records of any kind. I answered each question truthfully and completely. I had maintained no personal documentation. My contact with individuals from prior postings was minimal and administrative in nature. I had no journals. I had no correspondence except what was generated through formal administrative channels. She wrote on her form throughout. The form was angled away from me and I could not read it. Then she asked about threshold tolerance. She used this phrase precisely and without apparent expectation that I would need it defined. I did not ask her to define it. I understood, from context, that she was asking whether I could continue to function correctly in conditions where the information I was working with did not fully cohere, where what I was told did not match what I could observe, where the figures in one column did not match the figures in another, where the correct answer to a question and the true answer to the same question might not be the same thing. My hands had become cold at some point during the questions, I realized. Not noticeably, not trembling, not visibly wrong, but cold in the specific way that happens when the body understands something before the reasoning mind has finished catching up to it. I said that I had extensive experience maintaining correct function under conditions of incomplete information access, as the administratum's compartmentalization protocols routinely required operation with partial datasets, and that I understood my duty to be the correct completion of the work I was assigned rather than the pursuit of information outside my authorized access tier. This was a true answer. It was also, I knew as I said it, exactly the kind of answer that a person with high threshold tolerance would give to that question. Vess made a notation. She did not react. She concluded the audit with several final questions about my physical health, my sleep patterns, and my capacity for independent work in isolated conditions. Then she closed the form, placed it face down on the desk, and told me I had been very cooperative and that the audit's results would be communicated through the standard notification channel within the standard processing window. She dismissed me with the same, even efficiency she had used throughout. I walked back to the receiving chamber. I sat at my desk. I looked at my terminal for several minutes before I opened a census bundle and began working. I had been assessed. I did not know the result, but I understood, with a clarity that did not require reasoning, that the result mattered in ways that a standard documentation audit result did not. I completed my work for the day with perfect accuracy. That night in my hab unit, I did not recite the catechism. I lay on the sleep rack and looked at the ceiling and thought about the interface port behind Vess's ear, and thought about threshold tolerance, and thought about the 12 scribes who had gone into the lower corridor and the particular silence that had followed, and I fell asleep, eventually, without having completed any particular thought. Holeth was not at his desk the next morning. I noticed this at the opening catechism when the space to my right was empty, and I assumed he was ill or had a delayed transit. The catechism was conducted with 5 voices instead of 6. I recited my portion correctly. We sat at our desks and began the work of the day. At some point during the second work period, a servitor entered the receiving chamber and took the desk to my right. It was a standard conversion: the grey robe, the interface augmetics along the jaw and temple, the eyes that processed rather than observed. I had worked alongside servitors in several prior postings without difficulty. They were efficient and precise and required no social accommodation. I did not find them disturbing in themselves. This one leaned forward over the desk, a specific forward lean. A slight anterior tilt from the lower spine, accompanied by a corresponding angle of the head. I knew this lean. I had seen it every working day for 2 months from the desk to my immediate right. I had noted it as a habit, unremarkable, simply the ergonomic preference of a specific person at a specific desk. The servitor had no ergonomic preferences. It had been configured to this posture, or the lean had not been chosen for it. The lean had simply remained. I stopped working for a moment. Not visibly, I did not put down my stylus or turn to look. I simply stopped, for perhaps 5 seconds, while my eyes remained on my terminal and my reasoning attempted to process what my body had already finished processing. Then I resumed. My entries were correct, my columns balanced. At the midday meal interval, I sat with my ration allocation and attempted to recall Holeth's face. I could construct the lean. I could construct the stylus rhythm, a 3-stroke pattern with a slight pause before the 4th, consistent enough that I could have identified it in a crowded room. I could construct his timing, his efficiency metrics, the approximate number of census bundles he processed in a standard work period. I could not construct his face. I worked at it for the full meal interval. I assembled the components I could access: medium height, grey robes, dark hair perhaps, and they did not cohere into a face. They remained fragments, inventory items, the record of an absence where a person had been. I understood, sitting with my ration allocation in the meal chamber, that this was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of malfunction or failure of my own memory. I had not known Holeth well, and 2 months is not long enough to make a face permanent. But wrong in the sense that I had been sitting next to this person every day for 2 months, and something had been done to that person, and I could not now remember his face, and that specific quality of not remembering felt constructed, felt deliberate, as though the absence of face had been prepared for in advance. This was, I acknowledged to myself, not a thought I could verify. It was possible I had simply not attended to Holeth's face. It was possible my memory was ordinary. It was also possible that the administratum's compartmentalization protocols applied to more than documents. I finished my meal allocation and returned to my desk. 3 weeks after Holeth's replacement, I found the recategorization documents. This requires explanation. I did not look for them. I was not in breach of any access protocol. What happened was this: a census bundle from the primary archive had been misfiled into my secondary archive stack, in the Tier 2 overflow section that I accessed perhaps twice a month for large volume cross-reference work. When I pulled the stack for a routine large volume session, the misfiled bundle came with it, and I opened it, assuming it was part of my standard queue. It was not. It was an internal documentation bundle from a tier designation I did not recognize, a level above my standard access, but one that my terminal, apparently, had not been configured to block at the physical access stage, only at the electronic search stage. The physical filing had been done incorrectly by someone, and the result was that the bundle was now in my hands and I was already reading it before I fully registered that I should not be. The documents inside were formal recategorization authorizations. They were exactly what the language said. Formal administrative documents reclassifying specific population clusters from one category to another. The categories were real. Administratum categories citizen tithe eligible on one side, processed resource allocated on the other. I had encountered both categories in standard administrative reference materials. Citizen tithe eligible was self-explanatory. Individuals counted as living population, subject to labor, tithes, tithe debt assessments, and census registration. Processed resource allocated was a category I had encountered in formal reference materials only, never in active practice. It applied, according to the standard glossary, to populations that had been formally redesignated as non-citizen resource units following compliance review. The recategorization documents before me bore dates spanning 3 decades. They covered subsectors Vale, 9, Korath Minor, and 2 others. The authorization chains were complete and unbroken at every level. The figures were large, not in the hundreds, but in the tens and hundreds of thousands per document across dozens of documents. Each document was signed by the responsible certifying officer at each tier. Each carried the appropriate administratum seals. None of them had the quality of hidden documents. They were not encoded, not encrypted, not disguised. They were simply filed in a tier that most scribes at my level would never have reason to access, and they had arrived in my hands only because someone in the archive had placed a bundle incorrectly. I replaced the bundle exactly where I had found it, in the overflow stack, in the correct position. I resumed my assigned cross-reference work. I completed it with full accuracy. I filed my entries. I signed out at the correct time. I did not take the bundle. I did not copy its contents. I did not report the misfiling. I did not ask any questions. I also understood, with a completeness that had been accumulating for weeks and now simply closed shut, what the node was for. Not tithe debt assessment, not any kind of administrative review, not holding, not processing. The lower corridor. The 12 scribes who had not come back up, Holeth's desk, and the servitor with the forward lean. The suitability audit, and the interface port, and the question about threshold tolerance. The census figures in my ledger that were not the census figures on Peleth's terminal. This was the node where the numbers were cleaned. The large figures, the actual figures, went into the lower levels and came out as smaller figures, formally certified, authorization complete, filed in a tier that most scribes would never access. And the smaller figures went into the standard census record and the tithe projections and the registers that the broader administratum used to understand the population of the subsectors in question. And the discrepancy between the large figures and the small figures was the accounting of what the lower corridor was for. I went back to my HAB unit. I lay on the sleep rack. I looked at the ceiling. I did not think about escape. This is important to understand. The thought did not arise. Not because I was incapable of it, but because some part of my reasoning had already arrived at the correct answer to the question of whether escape was possible, and the answer was, this is not the kind of thing you escape. Not because the corridors were guarded, not because my access was monitored, though both of those things were presumably true, but because escape implies an outsider place to go that is outside the mechanism, and I had just finished understanding that the mechanism I was inside was not a local aberration or a corrupt sub-facility operating in. Deviation from the correct imperial order. The authorization chains were complete and unbroken at every level. This had been happening for 30 years. Across 6 subsectors, with complete formal documentation, correctly filed, correctly certified, correctly maintained, no investigation, no interruption, no correction. Not because no one had noticed. Because this was correct. Within the Imperium's accounting, within its methods and its doctrine, and its vast systemic mathematics of resource and tithe and population management, what was happening here was not a deviation, it was a function. I lay on the sleep rack for a long time with this understanding, and it did not move through me the way horror is supposed to move through a person. It simply settled. The way a column of figures settles when the final entry is made and the total is correct. I was inside a correct system. I had been doing correct work. The morning catechism felt different in the days that followed. Not wrong, the words were the same words, the sequence was the same sequence. But I recited them with a new quality of attention, listening to what they said beneath what they said. Every figure in every ledger was a faithful record of his will made manifest in number. I had been recording figures for months. The figures were correct. They were also, I now understood, one of two parallel sets of correct figures for the same population. I thought about this a great deal. The new cohort of scribes arrived on a tertius morning 6 weeks after I found the recategorization bundle. 8 this time, not 12. No Arbeits escort, or rather, the Arbeits were there, but positioned at the outer corridor rather than the inner, and they left after the cohort was inside, which was different from the previous arrangement. I watched from the receiving chamber as Pelath led the new arrivals through the intake corridor. He moved with the same economy of motion, the same practiced containment. He assembled them in the receiving chamber, our chamber, the same desks, though 2 of the other original 6 had by then been replaced as well, and began the briefing. I heard it from my desk. Every word. The receiving station processed tithe debt assessments for the outlying agri-sectors. The work was cross-referencing in nature. Compartmentalization was standard protocol and should not be interpreted as a reflection of trust. Questions about adjacent areas or lower sub-levels would be redirected to formal information request channels. The words were precise. The cadence was flat and measured. The specific economy of language was identical to the briefing I had received on my first day, which I now understood I could not have noticed at the time because I had not yet learned to listen for what it contained. One of the new scribes, seated in the second row, a young man with the attentive posture of someone who takes careful notes, raised his hand and asked about the lower sub-levels. Pelath looked at him. The same 2-second pause, then the holding station explanation, delivered with the cadence of a recited text. I watched the young man nod. I watched him accept the explanation and file it the way I had once filed it. I watched the specific quality of his acceptance, not credulous, not suspicious, simply the trained response of a person who has learned that the administratum provides the information it deems appropriate and that the correct response to incomplete information is to work correctly within its limits. I had looked like that. 8 weeks ago, 6 months ago, I had sat in that posture and worn that quality of acceptance. I did not warn him. I did not look at his face. I already knew what I would lose of it. The work continued. I was correct. I was precise. My columns balanced every day. I understood, in those weeks, the specific architecture of what Vermillion was and how it used people like me. We were not selected for indiscretion. We were not selected for weakness. We were selected because our particular combination of competencies, pattern recognition, cross-reference accuracy, the specific intelligence that allows a scrivener to find discrepancies in large datasets, made us useful in a particular way, useful for finding things. And because the system needed us to find things, it also needed us to find the right things in the right order, at the right pace, and in the correct psychological state when the finding was complete. The suitability audit had not been assessing whether I was capable of doing the work. It had been assessing whether I was the correct type of person to receive the finding, whether I would process it in the correct direction, inward, silent, immobilizing rather than outward, vocal, disruptive. I had scored correctly. I understood this now. The document I had found in the overflow stack had not been misfiled by accident. Or rather, perhaps it had been, and perhaps not. It did not matter. What mattered was that the system had a procedure for people like me, and that the procedure included a moment of finding, because the finding was part of the assessment. The correct response to finding was to continue working. I had continued working. I was now, I understood, past the finding stage and in the final stage. There was only one stage after this. I knew what it was before Pelath brought me the summons. I had known for some time, in the vague, wordless way one knows a weather shift before it arrives, not from any specific evidence, but from the accumulated pressure of everything that had already occurred. The suitability audit had assessed me and found me correct. Holeth had been found correct and was now at the desk beside me, leaning forward. The 12 scribes from the earlier cohort had been assessed as correct. The recategorization documents covered 30 years of correct assessments. I had one morning where I understood all of this with complete clarity before the summons arrived. I sat at my desk and did my work, and it was correct, and my columns balanced, and I filed my entries, and I recited the morning catechism, and I ate my meal allocation, and I signed out on schedule. And then the morning came when I arrived at my desk and found the parchment folded beneath my terminal. Pelath was waiting at the back of the chamber. Standing 3 paces from my desk, hands folded, watching me with the same assessment quality attention he had used the evening I asked about the lower corridor. He had not called my name. He had not spoken at all. He was simply present, and the parchment was there, and I understood that this was the form the summons took. I unfolded it. The document bore the administratum's highest available seal for internal procedural compliance, a seal I had seen in reference materials but never on a document addressed to me. The text was formal and procedurally correct in every particular. It described a standard reassignment processing notification. The language was indistinguishable from the transfer order that had brought me to Vermillion, except for one field near the closing section, continuation classification, which was blank. I read the document twice. I folded it. I placed it in my breast pocket. Pelath said, "You are not in trouble. You have performed your duties correctly." His eyes were focused on a point past my shoulder. His voice had the quality of a recitation from which all feeling had been procedurally removed, not a man telling a lie, not a man telling the truth, but a man completing a required step in a process whose other steps he had completed many times before. I asked no questions. There were no questions whose answers would have changed the document in my pocket, the field labeled continuation classification, or the destination we were walking to. I tidied my desk with the end-of-day precision I applied every evening, though it was not evening. I arranged my styluses in the correct order. I aligned my census bundles against the edge of the secondary document rack. I closed my terminal. Then I stood and followed Pelath into the corridor. The lower levels had a different quality of air, not worse in any simple sense, not fouler or more poisonous, but older, somehow. The recycling systems down here were older, and the air they produced was the air of decades of reuse, of the same molecules passing through the same filters in the same patterns, until the distinction between fresh air and processed air became technical rather than experiential. The emergency strip lighting I had navigated by during the wrong turn incident was the primary lighting source for the lower corridor. The amber-tinted units of the upper chamber were not present here. Pelath led me without speaking. I knew the route. Auditor Vess was waiting in the chamber I had entered briefly, once, from a wrong direction in low light. The room was better illuminated now. I could see it fully. The equipment was active. The primary workstation was lit, its displays showing readouts in formats I did not fully recognize, medical assessments, I thought, or neurological ones, the kind of monitoring that would be appropriate for the kind of procedure I was now approaching. The restraint fixtures were not deployed. They were folded into the workstation framework, present but not extended, which felt, in some precise way, like a consideration. Vess stood behind the desk. The form was already partially completed. My name was at the top, written in the standard administrative hand, in permanent ink. She explained my new assignment. The language was the language of her previous audit, even, procedural, specific. The assignment would make excellent use of my particular capabilities. The transition would be brief and involve minimal discomfort. My contribution to the administratum's work would continue in a form appropriate to my demonstrated competencies. She did not use the word servitor. She slid the form across the desk. She placed the stylus parallel to it, in the correct position for right-handed use, because she had noted during the audit that I was right-handed. The continuation classification field was at the bottom of the form, and it was blank. I looked at the form. I looked at Vess, who looked back at me with the specific stillness of a person who has waited through this moment many times and understood that the moment had its own duration, which could not be abbreviated, and did not attempt to abbreviate it. She was not impatient. She was not unkind. She was performing a step in a process that had been performed correctly for 30 years, and her part of the step was to wait, and she waited. Peleth stood 2 paces behind me. I thought about the figure on his terminal, 173,412. I thought about Holeth's lean, the servitor with Holeth's lean, the face I could not reconstruct. I thought about the 12 scribes who had walked through the lower corridor door and the silence that had followed. I thought about the young man in the second row of the new cohort who had nodded at the holding station explanation and filed it correctly, the way I once had. I thought about 30 years of recategorization documents, correctly filed, authorization chains complete and unbroken, from citizen tithe eligible to processed resource allocated. I picked up the stylus. I held it over the blank field for a moment. The moment had no particular dramatic quality. It was simply a pause, a gap in the process, during which I was still the person I had been when I arrived at Vermillion, and after which I would begin to be something else. I was aware of this. I believe this awareness was, in some sense, what the pause was for. Vess waited. The stylus moved. My name, in the continuation classification field, the correct administrative hand, permanent ink. Vess accepted the form. She placed it in the correct intake position on the secondary document rack. She made a notation in her own working file. She said, without particular emphasis, "Thank you for your cooperation." The process was initiated. I still cross-reference census data. This is true. The ledgers still come. The figures still need to be checked against projection models. The variance reports still need to be filed within the standard processing window. The work is the same work I have always done. I am precise. I make no errors. My columns balance. I do not remember the young man's name from the second row seat of the new cohort. I remember that he sat in the second row and raised his hand and nodded. I do not remember his face. I cannot tell whether this is ordinary forgetting or whether it is the kind of forgetting that was prepared for in advance, the kind that moves through you without asking, the kind that takes from you what it needs and leaves the shape of where the thing was without the thing itself. I remember the catechism. I recite it every morning with whatever voices are present. Every figure in every ledger was a faithful record of his will made manifest in number. This is true. I understand it more completely now than I did before. I do not know what that makes me. I know what it makes my entries. The administratum does not make errors. I was told this on my first day of service 19 years ago by a training overseer whose name I have lost entirely. I believed it then in the way that a person believes things that have not yet been tested. I believe it now in a different way, completely, without reservation, in the specific manner of a belief that has been tested and confirmed. The confirmation is not a comfort. It is not a peace. It is a correct answer in a column that was always going to balance, and it balanced, and the ledger is closed, and there is nothing left to carry forward.